The legendary English longbowmen of the Middle Ages. Obviously their primary weapon was the warbow and the arrow accompanying it. But what weapons did they carry for hand-to-hand combat? Well, in some places you'll hear people talk about archers' falchions or archers' picks, but it seems for the most part this is complete rubbish. So what hand weapons did medieval English archers actually carry to the battlefield? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, we should of course mention that the main purpose of an archer is to provide themselves with a bow and arrows. They would come with some arrows and then they would be given some livery arrows by the king, which was stored primarily at the Tower of London. If you were going on a military campaign. However, these are undisputably the main weapons of the English archer and the main purpose of the English archer, or it could be any other archer actually in most other countries, was to operate their bow. But it's very clear from the written sources, and well, we'll look at these in a second, that it's very important to have backup weapons, because archers didn't only shoot arrows at the enemy, they also got into hand-to-hand combat and they needed to be able to protect themselves if attacked by enemy infantry. So in fact we have just numerous sources which describe English archers having swords. Okay, now it is interesting to note that in England sword and buckler was a particularly popular pastime. It was in lots of other parts of Europe as well, particularly Italy for example, and sword and buckler were the standard kind of dueling armament of the English kind of working class man. They were the standard, and so much so, in fact, there were laws that came out in the 13th and 14th centuries talking about don't carry these around in the street at night in London or York, for example, because these were the standard armaments. So it should come as no surprise that someone who is essentially a commoner, working class, sometimes middle class people who were furnishing service to the king as longbowmen should choose as their sidearms the things which they had as sidearms anyway. So no surprise there. But moreover, we even see in the sizes of arms and the sort of royal decrees saying that if you're going to come giving military service, you need to come with a bow and some arrows, and you need to come with a sword. It doesn't always mention a buckler, but that is implied quite a lot in England. And sometimes it also mentions the dagger. Now, just putting the sword and the buckler down for a second, the dagger in question could be a rondel dagger like this, so a specialised kind of anti-armour dagger. It could be something more like a bollock knife or whatever. They don't really specify. It could even be a quillon dagger. But the important thing here is the standard things that the minimum that you're expected to turn up with, let's say in the 14th century, is a bow, a sword, almost always a dagger, and even if it's not mentioned, it's implied, and very likely a buckler. One interesting slight tangent is that if we go to Burgundy, for example, the archers there are told to bring a longsword, a two-handed sword. So slight difference, and that's probably a cultural difference because sword and buckler was more popular in England, whereas if you went to Germany, for example, longsword might be more popular, and it seems that in Burgundy, the Duke of Burgundy wanted them to be furnished with longswords. But fundamentally, a sword is indisputably, either with or without a buckler, the most common sidearm. Now, about the sword, the most common sword at this time was an arming sword, or sometimes a longsword, but fundamentally a straight double-edged sword. And it should be mentioned, sometimes people refer to archers' falchions, like that's a specific type of weapon. It's not. Do we sometimes see falchions in artwork on the sides of archers or crossbowmen? Yes, we sometimes do. However, do not think that it is a 13th century knightly falchion like the Conyers or the Cluny falchions. No, it is something more akin to this. The Wakefield hanger. This is a late 15th century style hanger. This is from the Royal Armourers range that I work on with windlass. But this type of, essentially, almost like a short sabre, a little single-edged sword that's easy and convenient to wear as an alternative to the arming sword. So usually, certainly for English archers, the standard sword being carried would be an arming sword. And in fact, Mancini, the Venetian ambassador, specifically talks about them wearing quite long arming swords. But yes, indeed, sometimes they might instead carry something like a hanger or we could call it a falchion, but remember it's not like the earlier, very broad 13th century knightly falchions, it's more like this. So what about archers, mauls and hammers, I hear you cry? We're going to get to that in a second, but before we do, there's another really important weapon which is actually mentioned in a number of the 100 Years' War sources associated with archers, repeatedly mentioned in fact, being associated with archers. And it might not be one that you've thought about. That is the axe in its various forms. So looking at the original language sources, so sometimes they're written in Latin, sometimes they're written in French, very occasionally they're written in English. But we see both the words for axe, hache in French, or hatchet used. Now, what I'm holding here is clearly a smaller axe and a bigger axe. Now, obviously we can't be that precise from written sources, but it is interesting that the word hatchet is used because hatchet implies a small axe. Now, these, of course, aren't necessarily dedicated weapons, and we have to state, much like mauls and other things they might use, English archers, despite the fact that they almost probably, at least professional archers, pretty much all had a sword and probably a dagger always as well, they did also make use of anything that was lying around, and if you are trying to fell fallen French or Bohemian knights or whatever, then clearly you're just going to use whatever's to hand and whatever is most appropriate to that moment. And in some cases they would be tools. So I'm not saying that they didn't sometimes carry axes specifically as weapons. Maybe they did. They are mentioned, axes are mentioned in the sources, and as are hatchets. However, it's very likely that these are simply camp tools, and remember that on the Agincourt campaign, famously, and thereafter, English archers often carried stakes, wooden stakes. Now, what do you need to harvest and make wooden stakes? You need these. You absolutely need some type of forestry tool. I mean, you could use a billhook and you could use other things, but we absolutely know they had axes and hatchets. So these could have been lying around associated with the stakes and therefore picked up quickly to use as weapons. And of course there is I won't go into depth on it, but there is the case of defacing fallen enemies, which is specifically mentioned in some sources, and that is described as being done with hatchets. So the hatchets were clearly around, whether they were tools or weapons, and archers clearly used them. So we absolutely know that archers used axes and hatchets. It's mentioned in various sources. But another weapon which comes up mentioned occasionally, and which you'll find on the internet categorically mentioned as a weapon of archers, is the maul. What is a maul? Well, fundamentally it's a large hammer, probably usually made of wood, the standard maul, but we sometimes read references to leaden mauls. Now, particularly when we're looking at, for example, Agincourt, there's an implication that the mauls are associated with driving in the wooden stakes, which we know that they were ordered to have and carry by Henry V. Is that the case? We fundamentally just don't know. We don't know if the mauls were a deliberate, planned weapon for the archers, or if they were just incidental and the archers picked up and used the mauls because they were there for driving in the wooden stakes, perhaps much like the axes were. But what's really puzzling is that mauls continue to be mentioned in association with English archers way into the 16th century. So I'm going to quote here from a really good paper that's been written called Medieval Warhammers Made of Lead, by Patrick Turner and Carl Paus. And so here it goes. In a Tudor tract of 1562 by Henry Barrett, archers are described carrying a maul of lead with a pike, which means spike, of 5 inches long, well steeled, that means made of steel, set in a staff of 5 foot of length with a hook at his girdle to take off and maintain the fighting, as our elders have done by hand strokes. So there's a description there of a very specific type of weapon with a lead head, but with a metal spike sticking out of the top. Now, we could just write off this description as a later Tudor invention, a weapon that wasn't being used at an earlier time. But if we go back to a description relating to Agincourt from the Chronique de Religio de Saint-Denis, it mentions a clavum plumbium, which translates as leaden club. Now, a leaden club isn't really a maul or a mallet. It's not really something necessarily for driving in wooden stakes. And according to the Chronique, it says these leaden clubs were unknown until then, and a single blow of them on the head could knock a man down or kill him. So again, we've got this mention of this specific type of weapon associated with English archers that seems to be at Agincourt a new type of weapon, but is perhaps being mentioned all the way through the 15th century and perhaps even shown in art, we'll get to that in a second, and still being mentioned in the mid-16th century. Now, interestingly enough, as you probably know, Calais was English until really quite late, after the 100 Years' War had ended, still until Henry VIII's time. And in Calais, actually in the arsenal there, storage of weapons, were 824 lead mallets recorded. And in fact, as this article shows, these lead clubs, lead mallets, are recorded, even shown in art and recorded in the written sources and descriptive accounts right the way through the 15th century and into the 16th century. And in 1474 to 75, there was a siege, a Burgundian siege of Neuss, or Neuss, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And there they found some of these very weapons. And here is one that I'm going to show on screen there. And they are made of lead, so they look like a hammer, but this is an entire lead casting, and that is an iron blade inserted into the lead casting, and the whole thing was mounted onto a wooden shaft of unknown length in this case, but if we go to the English written sources, about 5.5 foot long, let's say. So, potentially, we have here what you see in front of your eyes here. Potentially, not definitely, but potentially another weapon of English archers. And not only English archers, but they were also used all over the continent as well by various types of other infantry. So it does seem that the primary weapons of the English archer, of the legendary English archer, obviously was the bow, the war bow, the longbow, and the arrows that accompanied it. But English archers pretty much always, in fact they pretty much had to, it was stated in the sort of law that they had to have a sword and a dagger, and that would have usually involved a buckler as well. Pretty much always, perhaps the odd person might have chosen a different type of sword, but a sword and a dagger. And there's a possible connection between them and the use of axes and hatchets. It's very likely, in my opinion, that those axes and hatchets were predominantly tools, but happened to be useful in certain situations. And possibly, this type of very specific type of lead shod, well, not even lead shod, it's not even like a lead shod mallet, it's a specifically cast and made warhammer, really. It's a cheap, therefore, lead warhammer with an iron spike at the top. It's possible that English archers were also carrying and using these, and certainly by the middle of the 16th century, it seems to be that archers are being told to carry these. The only real question is how many of them actually did. Was it something theoretical, that the Tudors liked the idea of this dual-armed man, which we know that they did? Did they want longbowmen to also be able to operate as more effective close combat infantry? Or was, as some sources suggest, this actually an old tradition going back to Agincourt and possibly pioneered and done for the first time at Agincourt, whereby archers doubled up as close combat troops by using what was essentially a poleaxe? What do you think? There's a lot more research to be done on this. I know that some people out there, some who will probably be watching and some who might comment on this video, have actually been involved in some of this research. So thank you to those who've gone before. I am only a small cog in the machine here, but I really hope we can dig up more sources, more archaeological evidence, and get to a closer answer on this, because these are fantastic and interesting weapons, and I think they get us a little bit closer, maybe, to understanding why the longbowman was such a potent and important military unit on the battlefield in the Wars of the Roses, for example, but also in wars on other parts of the continent as well. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. Of course, I will continue to be. And hopefully this is just the beginning of this research, and we'll see more about this in the future. Thanks a lot for watching. Hope I'll see you soon. Make sure you're subscribed. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.